Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the JMO Podcast. I'm your host, Taylor Michaels, and this week's guest, Hall of Fame legendary angler Al Lindner. Our conversation this week is all about weed walleyes. As you'll hear Al in the interview talk about, catching walleyes in the weeds is not for the faint of heart. There's a lot of nuance and it takes a lot of experience, but no matter where you live across the Midwest, there are hungry walleyes living in and around some weeds, so you're not going to want to miss what Al has to say on this week's podcast. So having Al Lindner on the line, I decided on a topic of weed walleyes, and that's a gigantic topic. There's no way that we're going to cover all the nuance or knowledge that you have on weed walleyes in our time frame. So I wanted to narrow it down a little bit by the time of year, something applicable to where we are now in August or coming into August. But I'd like to let you kind of pick some of your favorite, most relevant weed bites, whether it's lakes and, big lakes, known lakes, or maybe some of the smaller gems around, that Brainerd Lakes area where you're at. What are some of the notable things when it comes to a weed bite or finding the productive water for a good weed bite in the month of August?
Well, the first thing that I want to say is if any good walleye lake that has a good, strong population of walleyes, a good portion of those fish use the weeds all year long. And in some, and not in some bodies of water, a bigger portion use the weeds than use the deep water structure or are suspended over the flats or suspended in open water. A lot of fish are doing a lot of different things at the same time. And at the same point, not all of the walleyes in a lake are in the weeds, but a good portion of them on a lot of lakes are. And for many, many years, people would think when they caught a walleye in the weeds, oh man, this was a fluke, because they had that structure fishing mentality. Walleyes are supposed to be on structure. And one of the other neat things about weed walleyes, in many bodies of water, they're the biggest fish in the system. And a lot of people got a hard time getting their head around that simple fact, that those walleyes up in that shallow water, some are up there all year long. In many cases, on many bodies of water, they truly are the biggest fish in the system. Fishing weeds is not an easy. This is not an easy thing. This is not for the faint of heart. If you're gonna be a good jig fisherman and you're ripping weeds consistently, it takes work. I mean, to stay on a bite, on a good bite, not an easy presentation. It's not like a dragging a red-tailed chub on a Lindy rig in 15 feet of water where the fish is, the bait is telling you're about to have a bite. My rod is going ding, ding, ding. That isn't the case when you're ripping weeds with a jig for walleyes, although the strike can be quite distinct. There's no question about that. So the first thing that I want to make the listeners aware of is if you got a good walleye lake, you got walleyes in the weeds at that time of year. There's no question about it. Absolutely, hands down, a fact.
So when you're breaking down water, whether you're looking objectively at a lake that you've fished forever and you can't figure out where the walleyes are, or if you're looking at stocking reports and you're pursuing a lake for the first time and, all the fishing reports say there's walleyes in there and you're going to find that weed bite, what are some of the things you could do before you get your boat wet as far as finding spots or finding that productive water, kind of that square one? Where do you start?
I always look for the biggest piece of structure I could find. And, a dominant, it's a no-brainer. You look at a map, it's a lake with a lot of structure. I'll start with a shoreline structure. And from my experience, that if there's a big shoreline structure, a big flat, the biggest flat you could find, let's say the flat is 8 feet. A lot of lakes that I fish, the way I would describe this is pretty typical in the Brainerd Lakes area. The structures are about 8 feet of water. It's 8-9 foot across the top, and it starts rolling at 10 to, and it breaks to like 10 to 15 fairly quick. That's typical on a lot of the lakes that I fish. And so I target these big flat areas because the bigger rule of thumb, the bigger the structure, almost inevitably the more schools of fish it can hold. It holds more fish more often. Yeah, so I don't pick little minute little structures. I'll fish those in passing, but if I'm really trying to get on a big school of big fish, I know that the bigger the structure, the bigger the population of fish that are on their walleye wise. So that's where I'll start. And usually the first things I'll look for, if you study your contour map, and let's say you got a Lake Master chip in there, which is really a real accurate chip, and you'll see the inside corners usually are tighter drop offs, and you come out on the points, and they could be longer tapering flats coming out off the point, and when you come into the corners, everything tightens up. And usually I like to start on those inside cups, those inside corners. And they seem to be this time of the year, really consistent. But here's the thing that I really look for. I try to find weed beds that are clumpy and not totally choked together. And what you need living space for those walleyes to hunt and navigate and move around through. If the weed bed is so dense, it's really hard. The only time you're going to make contact on that is when they stick their nose out to the base of the weed line and come out of there. If you could find clumpy, sparser patches of weeds, almost inevitably, because you could get your bait to the fish. And they like that they hunt, they can move around better through those areas. If it's dense, thick cover, and a lot of lakes do get like that, you're forced to concentrate strictly on the edge of the weed line. Whether it's in 8 feet of water, 12 feet of water, and with zebra mussels and the weed growth that we're seeing in a lot of our lakes today, they're clearing up. I'm fishing lakes that got weed lines in 20, 22 feet of water now. And these lakes never used to have weeds growing that deep. It's just amazing on how it's impacted the fishery. Speaking of weed walleyes, I'm going to name a lake that I grew up and guided on and learned a lot about walleye fishing in the Brainerd Lake here. It's called Gull Lake, community lake right in town here. And a lot of the guides fish it. It's heavily, intelligently fished by guides in just a local community here. And it's one of our better walleye lakes. And once the zebra mussels got in this lake, let me go back to it. Prior to the zebra mussels getting in this lake, the midsummer bite was a structure bite, and the fish were generally 18 to 25 feet of water. Pretty typical. And in rigging, you could pull bottom bouncers and spinners. That was the main presentation, in the middle of summer on that lake. Once these weed beds got thick and grew to those depths, all these fish are buried in the weeds. And the guides will tell you, everything is weed line now. We don't get those out of weed deep water structure bites until the lake turns over and falls. The fish got up in the weeds and they're using that heavy cover and they're not coming at it. And he says you could, on the inside edges of some flatland trolling bites, at night, you could even jig some of the areas where you come on the inside edge at 8 feet and the weeds get real thin. It's like gravelly, sparse weeds. And you could catch some fish. If you get a little overcast, a little wind, something like that, anything that gives you a little help, as long as it isn't sun, anything that breaks that surface a little bit. And it's still one of the biggest challenges walleye anglers have, by and large, is getting the concept that you could go in these weed beds and catch some of the biggest fish in the lake.
And I love how you're so good at referencing the past. It's what a time we live in now with all this technology in the fishing industry and all the gadgets, right down to newer technology in fishing line and like the jig makes up, and then the plastics, not to mention the electronics. And so you look at walleye patterns, these weed patterns that are changing with while the ecosystem changes, while these lakes clear up and the zebra mussels, at the same time, the fishing industry and the nuances of fishing are changing. So it's almost kind of changing together. What would you say some of the weed walleye nuances that from 25 years ago or 20 years ago to now?
Well, I think we have more fish using weeds because many of our lakes are more eutrophicated than they were many years ago. A lot of these lakes that I'm fishing now, when I first started guiding here 40, 50 years ago, when I moved to the Brainerd area, and a lot of these big lakes, there was no weeds in the main lake. There were mainly rock gravel. As the lakes eutrophicated, the weed beds started in the shallower water basins, way out of the main lake. And they slowly developed over years and years and years. And then the weeds finally grew out into the main lake areas now on all of these lakes, and they're just filled with weeds now. And I can remember when there wasn't a strand of cabbage out there. There wasn't a weed on these bars. Yeah, and now they're all over the place on all of these lakes. So that eutrophication had a lot to do with it. The systems are changing constantly. Our lakes are changing constantly, and one of the things anglers kind of have a hard time making changes. This is at this time of the year. Last year, every year I catch walleyes in 12 feet of water, dragging a bottom bouncer on a leech on this lake on this structure. And then all of a sudden you hit 1 year and they're not there, and you hit a second year and they're not there anymore. And that environment had changed some. The weeds could have went deeper down. The weeds could have got thicker. They could, they could have got catchier. A different kind of weed growth came in that choked out the healthy weeds. And by the way, when I'm saying healthy weeds, generally again, I'm using a lot of lakes in my area that I would term mesotrophic lakes. When you get in the plains area where you guys fish a lot of the shallower water, generally somewhat dishpan lakes, although there is structure in them, but they're shallower basin lakes. And the lakes that I got here, we got lakes 89 to 100 feet of water. A lot of these clear water lakes. And the environment is changing constantly, and the anglers are slow to adjust to a lot of it. And the good weeds, that if you could find good weeds are cabbage. Broadleaf cabbage is number one, and it's usually sparse enough where you could fish in and around it. And coontail and Eurasian milfoil, these three weeds will hold walleyes. Then there's a weed that we're dealing with, and I don't even know what you call it. And in about the last 8 years, 6 to 8 years, as these lakes tend to get a little more eutrophic, I'm seeing this weed in a lot of bodies of water. It's like a string. It's a tall, thin string green weed. It's green, but it is so dense that you can't fish a lure through this stuff. You can't make a complete cast and rip through it. It's constantly on a jig, on a crankbait, anything you're trying to get through it. It's very, very difficult. And the problem is the walleyes are still in this stuff. They're there, but the fishing is so hard to get the bite out of it. It's rare to be able to make a complete cast and rip it back and make a 40-foot cast and fish it all the way back and have a clean jig. This stuff is just tangled constantly.
Yeah, so feeding off of that and getting into, finding some of the spots that you like, even if you kind of get up against it and you realize that most likely the fish are in a hard to get to spot like usual, getting into the methods. What are some of your, when you find a spot or you're going to work your way through a spot that you think is productive, how do you evaluate that and choose your methods?
This time of year, to concentrate on these weed fish, you got one method that works really, really good is you could pull a spinner over the top of them. Finesse spinner, lightweight spinner with a bullet sinker on it. And depending, as long as the weeds aren't grown to the top, I'm talking where they might be 4 or 5 feet below. And these fish will come out of there. They're not real. You don't have to fish a long line. It's amazing. They don't get spooked when you're coming over if there's pockets in those weeds. So you can do really good with a spinner, or you can do the same thing with the spinner at the base of the weed line. But that spinner can work really, really good at this time of the year. You could on some bodies of water, you could throw crankbaits to the outer edge, and just rip those fringe weeds with a crankbait. Day in and day out, personally for me, it's a jig. I love jig fishing. I love it, and I think I could do more with a jig fishing weed walleyes than I can with any other delivery system myself. And when you're talking a jig, I like a jig. One of my one of our sponsors and our marketing partners is BMC. And they came out with a jig called the Moon Knight Jig. This was some years ago. And it's like an aspirin head jig. It's kind of a flat-sided, it's a flat jig, like an aspirin, shaped like an aspirin. And they put a big eye on this thing. And I started fishing that with soft baits when they first came out with this thing. And I played with the blue tails and split tails and curly tails and about every concoction you can imagine, that we have available in plastics today that work for walleyes. And from my experience, it boils down. I really only use two body shapes right now. I'm convinced I don't need to go to some of the other shapes under a lot of years of playing with it. One is the boot tail, and I like a flatter side boot tail, not necessarily the bigger round boot tails. I like a flatter side boot tail on this style of jig. And the reason I'm saying that, it's thin. It's almost like a shad shape, but the shape of the bait is thin. And on that aspirin head, you can, if you're fishing weeds really hard, this particular jig's got a little piece of wire that hooks and holds the plastic up. But even then, after you get in heavy plastic, sometimes you're better off. You got to put a spot of glue on there, and then you can, then you keep that plastic on. You can catch quite a few fish on one piece of plastic. But you got to glue it because you're ripping through these weeds pretty hard with this stuff.
Sure.
And so I got that boot tail, and then I like a flat-sided split tail, like the original fluke would be the definition of the first guys that made a bait like this. And now there's probably at least 12 or more major manufacturers make a copy of the exact same bait as that fluke, but it's a flat-sided split tail. As far as length goes, day in and day out, on that I fish it's about a 4-inch bait. Yeah, and I found you catch plenty of big fish on it. You don't have to go to a 6-incher or that you fish it day in and day out, you're going to get a big fish bite on it as well as a small fish. It just seems almost universal to me. Yeah. Anything around 4 inches, easy to fish on a spinning rod. I can cover a lot of water with it. So that, that's one of my go-to baits, and just that split tail and standard flat-sided boot tail, day in and day out for me, delivers the goods.
Talk, even expand a little bit on your setup. What do you like to get out of your rod? I mean, if you're going to be up casting weeds all day, what's your rod and reel setup look like? How heavy, how long a stick are you using? What's your line setup? How detail oriented do you really like to get? Or are you more of a keep it simple kind of guy?
I keep it pretty simple. I really do. In my jig fishing, I use generally it's a medium action spinning rod, an Icon, and they have a 6/8 snap jigging rod, that one model that I really like. And I just got really used to that action. It's a fast action rod. It just fishes really comfortable. And when I'm fishing weeds like this, I don't like a real long rod myself. Not like I like if I'm out of weeds and I'm fishing deeper and I'm live bait rigging and stuff like that, then a longer rod becomes an asset. But in those weeds like that, I like a shorter rod. It's just easier for me to control, like a 6/8 or a 6/10. That's what I like in a rod action. Medium, but it's got to have some backbone because it can't be a soft rod because you're ripping those weeds off all the time. So 2/3 of the rod has got some backbone, and you got some give in that last 1/3, and but not real soft. It can't be real soft. Now I'm still a mono guy, and I know people are going to shake their head with this. Why don't you fish braid in that stuff? Braid cuts it, and it does. There's no. I don't think you can make a mistake. If you want to fish it with braid, go for it. I don't think it makes too much difference. I have learned when I'm out of those weeds and stuff in shallower water, say 15 feet or less, I really believe I get more strikes with mono than I do with braid. I don't know why. It may be the way I'm moving the bait faster. I know when I'm snap jigging weeds with mono, I know I'm not moving that bait as much as I would move it with a braided line and a fluorocarbon leader. I'm not moving it as much, and it just seems to be getting me more bites. I don't know no other way to say it, but after hundreds of thousands of fish playing with this thing and other people in the boat and everything, maybe I just got so comfortable with this mono, the way I'm fishing it, and some of the mono Suffolk's came out with a stuff they call the advanced mono, and it's I don't know why they call it mono. It's really not like a mono. The stuff is low stretch, abrasion resistant. It's sensitive, but it fishes with the ease of mono. You never have no problems with it. Monofilament has always been easy to fish with.
Yeah.
You don't get wind knots and none of that stuff. And fluorocarbon on a full reel is an invitation for problems.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So what I use mono. In most cases, I'm using 8 or 10 pound test, depending on how much heavy cover I'm in. But I use a fluorocarbon leader. So I got the mono on my spinning reel. Let's say I'm using 8 or 10, 10, and then I got 8 pound test fluorocarbon leader because of the zebra mussels in the clear water licks that I'm fishing most of the time now. And I got a 6 foot a fluorocarbon leader. That's instead of braid and fluorocarbon, I'm using mono and fluorocarbon leader in a clear water environment.
The JMO Podcast is sponsored by Long Haul Trucking. Long Haul's always looking for more skilled professional CDL drivers to join their team. They're a people-first company, and it shows. Their employee-owned, asset-based fleet of over 350 Conestogas is among industry leaders in pay and benefits geared towards long-term success and growth for company drivers and owner-operators. If you're a professional driver or a company that wants to ship product with the best in the business, get a hold of Long Haul at 1-800-255-5153 or find them online at longhaultrucking.com. Long Haul, running on the power of promises kept. Talk about your thought process a little bit when so you've got your tried and true rod, your favorite jig stick. What is the method to your madness when you're breaking down water? How long are you staying in a spot? How many casts do you like to make? When it's clear and calm, do you like to set up a little ways away and make a little bit longer casts? What are some of the kind of the finesse details that you kind of like to pay attention to when you're working over water, these weed walleyes?
Again, when you're in conditions like you just said, in clear water lakes, and again, so many lakes that I'm dealing with it in fishing are got zebra mussels and air clear water. Although you got the plus access, the plus of walleyes being in cover. When they're in cover, they're not quite as spooky as they are when they're out of cover, where they have time to look at the bait. So you got some advantages in the weed walleye. They react quicker. When you're in clear water and you're bouncing a jig on sand, they have time to come in and look at a bait. This is still it's a reaction bite on their part, and I'm ripping that jig really fast. I'm really tearing it and letting it fall back. And weight-wise, I need to mention this. The biggest mistake that I've seen walleye fishermen make when they go to plastic is they're so used to fishing a jig and a minnow, a jig and a piece of crawler on it, or a jig and a leech. And the old rule of thumb in the walleye world for so many years is fish the lightest jig you can get away with. And that's fine if you're using live bait. So they're so used to using live bait, and they hear somebody like myself or somebody like Jason write an article about using plastic and ripping weeds, and you're hearing more and more and more really good anglers that are seeing how deadly a jig with soft baits or a hair jig can be in outfish live bait in many, many, many cases. And the guy says, well, I'm going to try this once. And he's never fished it before, and he fishes it the exact same way he would with a live minnow or a piece of crawler or a leech, which is real slow, sensitive, easy fishing. If you go to plastic, you can't do that. You have to fish. You jack up the weight. If you're fishing an 1/8 ounce with live bait, you go to a 1/4 ounce if you're fishing plastic. You jack up everything. You got to go heavier, faster. You got to remember it's a reaction bite. And that fish is responding. It's not coming in on a bait. It's not sensing it, smelling it, it's not there. That reaction bite is so different. So you have to fish quicker, faster, a real aggressive approach. And that's where they lose. They fish it the same way they would live bait, and then they're not seeing the results. They're saying, well, it doesn't outfish live bait. You're fishing it wrong. That's the simplicity of it. You have to fish a heavier jig head, and you got to fish faster. That's the simple rule of thumb with it. And I wanted to mention another thing that the last we're seeing a resurgence. Maybe that's not the right word. A resurgence probably isn't the right word. In the old days, way back, I can remember when I first started jig fishing for walleyes as a kid. You had baits like a Thompson doll fly, Upperman bucktail, a Canadian bluetail jig. These were hair chenille concoction baits. But hair jigs are coming back into the scene, and guys in the Great Lakes, they're starting to see in the last 3 years. We're hearing and seeing way more in my own experience. I'm fishing way more hair jigs than I ever have before because my confidence is skyrocketed in how deadly they are, and in reference to plastic, I don't have to. I can put a hair jig on, and if I'm on a hair jig bite, ripping the weeds with a hair jig, I could catch. I don't have to think with change plastic because it got tore after 3 or 4 fish. I don't have to do none of that. It's just bam, and when you're on fish, you just keep ripping it, and some of these hair jigs, I can catch as many as 40 fish. And I paid attention to this before they finally got enough hair out of it. But you can go that quick, and then somebody's bites like that hair jig, it's been a real eye opener to me. It's like I don't like to necessarily use the word magic, but I can't come up with anything else at this point.
Yeah.
And it rips weeds so good. It is so good. And again, something around 4 inches or so seems to be, universally easy to fish to trigger most bites consistently. But that hair jig, you're seeing a resurgence here, more and more and more. And I believe, and I said this in a couple of television shows already, I'd say in the next 2, 3, 4 years, this is going to continue. You're going to see many versions of this hair jig coming into the walleye world again. And guys are going to adapt it to a lot of different situations because it simply works. It really works.
What would you attest that to? When I think of a hair jig, I don't have a ton of experience with them, but I know guys that just absolutely love fishing with them for everything you just said. That durability, and they're built to win, and you don't have to slide a live bait or a plastic up the shaft. You're just always fishing your lines in the water more. Would you say ultimately just those physical operative aspects to it are what's putting fish in the boat, because you can make more casts over the day when you're not thumbing around with baits, or do you think the fish?
I think all of the above comes into play. It's something the fish have not been conditioned to see at all. The speed. A key thing we've learned with these hair jigs, and I'm in touch with a lot of really good walleye fishermen that follow some of the guys on the Great Lakes that are really tuned in to hair jigging, and they got me a little more tuned into it, and it kind of lit my fire to start dabbling with this more and more and more. And one of the things, the biggest mistake a lot of manufacturers make when they make them, and when you go in to look at them, although they're not easy, you don't see a lot of hair jigs in the walleye world yet. You got to look around a little, but they're starting to become more popular. More manufacturers are making them, and they like to put too much hair in them because they look good in the package.
Sure.
So they really bulk them up. You want the hair to be thin, not thick, and it is like it gets real thick, and there could be a place for that because it'll slow the drop speed. There's a time and a place for that. But when you're really moving that jig, there's no question, the thinner the hair, the more fish you're going to catch. And it looks in the water, it just breathes. It breathes. When it's real thick, they almost clump together. Yeah, and it could be a mixture of bucktail and chenille, some of the others. They kind of clump together when they're thick. They look great in the package. Looks like you're getting real value for your money, but they don't fish as good. The more thin it is, the more life it gets in the water, the more bites you get. When you run it in the water and you look at it, a thin hair jig versus a thick hair, you can see the thin hair is breathing and living. You can see it looks really alive.
No kidding. My dad's going to love to hear that, because I bet if you looked in the bottom of his tackle box, he's got some stuff that's still in the package, but you can probably hardly read the package. From back in the 80s, there's probably a lot of that around.
Well, there was. Yeah. I'm old enough now where I can remember those things. I fished with that stuff. Yeah, and then as trends and things changed. What killed the hair jig for walleye fishing that we had up north many years ago was when Mr. Twister came on the scene with the first soft plastic curly tail. And then after that, that was unbelievable for walleyes for how many years? You put a curly tail on the back of the jig, and it was like it was the magic bait, man.
Yeah.
I mean, you didn't need anything else. And then we transitioned to versions of tubes with legs on them, and today everybody's got boot tails. You got flat-sided boot tails, you got ribbed boot tails, you got smooth boot tails, you got big tails, you got finesse boot tails on skinny little. There's all kinds of varieties of them, and they do make a difference. The difference. The rib boot tails drop slower, great in cold water. You could get thinner ones with little tiny boot tails that I use when I want to fish really fast on a jig. And it's long and thin, and it fishes fast. And I've seen many conditions where the walleyes in particular and smallmouth can get so finicky that this real thin body with a little boot tail outfishes the ribbed or the flat-sided boot tail with the bigger tails. So, I mean, there's a whole lot of finesse to all of this stuff, a lot more than meets the eye.
Yeah.
And the more you start to fish with it, the rib boot tails like a Kitech, I'm using that because most people probably know the name of that.
Yep.
And that's all ribbed. Yeah, ribbed. Oh, it's a great bait. It's soft. Fish like it. It falls easier. It's got a pretty good sized tail on it. But then there's other times you could take that exact same shape, but you don't rib it. You mold it in a solid piece. And these manufacturers, the color combinations, they can make them look like real. They have finishes that look like perch, shiners, red tail, whatever you want. Some of these manufacturers, the finish on those, they can't do it on a rib bait, but you could do it on a smooth bait. And I mean, the colors are amazing. They look like the real thing when you pick it up. But these plastics now for walleyes and that, it's amazing what is there and how these little finesse things can make a difference, inclusive of these hair jigs. So, there's so many things to fishing the jig.
You mentioned a little earlier to produce some weed walleyes this time of year, just trolling a spinner. Would you say, just for aspects of covering water and maybe, this might be a little bit easier, more entry level, or do you think it's maybe a more difficult nuance pulling a spinner for weed walleyes and everything that goes into that?
A bullet sinker, simple bullet sinker, 24 inches of line, a 4 inches of line on it, light wire hook, in the middle of a piece of crawler day in and day out is tough to beat. On that, in some lakes you could put that you'll see if the minnow bite is better. And leeches don't necessarily work real good on this presentation, but the crawler or the minnow works the best. But a real good weed fisherman fishing over the tops and over those weeds. When you're doing this now, I was talking about like jigging like a 6.8 or a 6.10 rod. Right now, if you're doing this, the spinning rod somewhere over 7.72, something like that. I want to be able to hold that rod a little bit higher. Yeah, you get a nuance for the weeds if they're 4 feet down under the surface, something like that. Yeah, you can move that rod up. A longer rod gives you some pluses to go up and down depending on the speed and how you're picking those weeds without burying into them. It takes a little bit of boat control. It's not an easy thing to do. Anytime you're dealing with weeds, it takes some work.
Yeah, it takes a few runs.
What's the delivery system?
Yeah, you gotta, out in the Dakotas, those weed lines, they change every year. So it's, saving your plot lines from last year just about does you no good. It's going to take you 4 or 5 passes minimum just to get your run down.
It's not an easy thing for the average angler to get used to and get their head around that. Yeah, once you're dealing with weeds, it takes some work. It takes a little bit of a feel and some work. It's not easy fishing. It really isn't. The summer months, like we're talking now, the best bite you're going to get on that weed bite is in the morning, without a doubt. And like all these bites, in summer when the water is warm, the peak bite, I don't care if it's bass, muskies, walleyes, whatever, when you're in cover. In summer, it's that morning bite from 5:30 to 9:30, 10 o'clock is the best bite of the day. And then things will taper off. You'll get a little late evening bite again, but it's a shorter window where you could catch 3 to 4 hours from sun up well into the morning. If the fish are active in a weed, you can have a really, really good lengthy morning bite. That evening bite will narrow down to the peak might be an hour and a half tops. Yeah, and now in the daytime, if you're going to fish these fish in the daytime, wind is a huge plus. Yeah, there's no question about that. You're going to get more fish with a wind. Yeah. So you got that low life morning is number one. Evening short lived, but number two. Daytime, if you got wind, you're going to get fish. And you can get some of these fish on good lake with good walleye population. You can catch fish in the middle of the day. You just got to fish a little harder. But the peak, that morning peak, if you really want to get the best bite, it is a morning bite. Yeah, on most of these lakes that I have seen, and that holds true. And then come fall, it just reverses itself. The night bite is always good for the weed walleye bite. Flat lining, a minnow bait, over the top of those weeds has been done for years and years and years. It still is unbelievably deadly on any of these lakes that got weed walleyes in there at this time of the year. And it gets better as the fall season goes on because the weeds thin out more. And, can get to the fish a little bit easier. But that nighttime trolling over these weeds, it's an absolute killer. Absolute killer. And is it ever fun? It's just really, really fun.
And what are some things that maybe overlap a little bit when you're finding spots? A lot of times other species will show up. If I'm trying to fish some water that's either new to me or I haven't fished it in a while, I'm looking for that productive water. What are some of the other maybe species or things that are overlapping? Or maybe if you're trying to eliminate water, if you start catching a bunch of something, maybe you got to look somewhere else. What might be some of those fine details to figure in when you're looking specifically for the productive walleye weeds?
Well, one thing is, in a lot of our lakes, this kind of bite, the northerns can drive you crazy. Yeah, on some of these lakes, jigging or pulling spinners. You can get on some bodies of water where the pike are very heavy. Yeah, and they can just drive you bonkers. And usually, if I'm getting in an area where I got a lot of pike going, the walleyes aren't there. They're so aggressive that the pike are so aggressive that it slows down that walleye bite. Yeah, just an observation. But one thing about weeds in summer, and so all fish live in them. Yeah, at this time of the year, you're going there. We're talking mainly on walleyes, but there's pike in there. There's smallmouth bass on a lot of lakes in there. There's white bass. Everything that lives in a lake is in there to some degree. The deep weed lines, you can back troll like you would be pulling a spinner or a Lindy rig at the base of the weed and do this just with a jig too, and it is absolutely deadly. You get it away from the boat. You got to remember the weight of the jig is going to be critical. But you're dragging that jig, long line contour trolling the jig on the edge of the weed line. And you're just snap jigging it, snap jigging it, and snap jigging it. Yeah, I was talking a lot about casting and working with casting, holding out, throwing up. But my gosh, I do that a lot, but I also contour troll on the edge of those weeds a real lot. Because a big portion of those fish are easier to catch. Those fish that have their nose at the base of that weed line and stick their nose out there tend to be biters.
Sure.
Instead of the fish that are up inside that you got to scrounge out of there. And when they get a little active, they tuck their noses out there at those peak times where you got some wind coming in there or that. So that, standard back trolling with a jig instead of a live bait rig or a spinner. You slow down your back troll and follow those weed lines jigging on the bottom. Just rip jigging those outside edges of weeds. You can also control drift it in big wind. Yeah,
sure.
Although if you're control drifting it, one guy will be very close to the weed line. We're dealing in, let's say you're dealing with a 20-foot boat and you're control drifting the side of a weed line. And one guy's going to be out of the weeds pretty far. The other guy's going to catch most of the fish, but there's some fish that he'll catch.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it is that
make a big difference.
It's that tight spot. One thing I was going to ask you that I was just thinking of, like out in the Dakotas, when in the summertime when you do find the fish hunkered down in the weeds, they're not moving around very much, and it can be, depending upon the wind, very wind driven. It's a pretty, how do I say, replicable pattern. Is that, your perspective on weed walleyes where you're at, is it typically when you get on a good pot of fish on a good productive lake, you find that productive water, can you ride that out for a week, or do you typically find you get yourself prepared to go find new fish every day when you're thinking weed patterns?
No, well, if that spot holds for a period of time, remember walleyes are walleyes, and they like to run, and that's the thing. The nature of the walleye is to move a lot. They're not like largemouth bass that love to hunker down in one spot and stay there for 6 weeks and not move out of a clump of weeds. But when you get a school of walleyes, and their nature is to move a lot. The wind will move these fish. The bait moves around, and their walleyes have a tendency to move more than any other than salmon. And some of the Great Lakes fish, they move more than largemouth, smallmouth, pike, muskies. Yeah, their basic nature is they're in, out, up, and down a lot. Yeah, and that's how those weeds. They're into the edge of the weeds. They're in them. They're up in them. They're down in them. Yeah. But when you can get into big schools on one structure, you get a structure. There's a lot of fish that can get in a school on these lakes. And you can get 100-foot run of a weed line on a big structure. I don't know how many walleyes can get in there, but there's a lot where you've got lots and lots of fish for days and days and days, and then all of a sudden it's over.
And I could literally listen to you talk for 5 hours, but we've been on the phone for 50 minutes. I appreciate it so much. So I guess we can sign off. Do you want to maybe rattle off how people can look up some of your information, your social medias, or some of the websites and things where they can chase down some good information from you?
Yeah, day in, day out. And if you want to follow anything we're doing, just go punch up anglingedge.com and it'll direct you from there. Yeah, you can pay attention to what we do on television and short clips and our social media stuff. It's all there.
Awesome, Al. Well, I'll let you back to it, Al. I am so appreciative. Thank you so much for the fishing lesson.
Sounds good. Travel safe.
Right on.
Okay,
You too. We'll
later.
talk to you.
Bye-bye.
And thank you all so much for following along on another episode of the podcast. Make sure to head on over to our social medias at Facebook, Instagram at Jason Mitchell Outdoors, where you can recommend a guest or a topic for an upcoming show. Also, if you're tuning in on YouTube, Spotify, Stitcher, or Apple Podcast, make sure to like, subscribe, and share with all your friends.